was beaten a number of times. It was like living in Dracula's castle, and I wanted to die. My name's Gillie Jenkinson. I am a psychotherapist and specialise in something I've called post-cult counselling. And the reason that I do this work is because back in the 70s, I was in a cult called the Community. The Community was a cult, and the reason it was a cult is because there was a very strong leadership. There was a founder, and then there was someone who came and took over the leadership from that founder, and a very distinct leadership, very controlling, extremely abusive, and narcissistic and entitled, really, feeling they had the right to tell everybody what to do, what to wear, what to eat, which houses to live in, because we were a community of different households. Our exercise regime, everything was micromanaged, and if we didn't obey, we were punished. The earlier phases of the community were much freer. We could come and go, we could see family, but later I barely saw my family. I was 18 when I became a born-again Christian, and unfortunately that route took me down toward this group that became a cult, the Community. And I used to, like any teenager, I was looking for partners, I'm wanting to go out with boys, I was smoking and drinking and that kind of thing. And all of that changed. I used to wear a lot of makeup. I loved being quite glamorous. Okay, it was the 70s, late 60s, 70s. I kind of a pseudo hippie. I wasn't ever really a hippie. I was a bit too square for that. But, long dresses and thinking I looked cool and whatever. And all of that changed, and I ended up wearing sort of polyester dresses that I would have put down to something a granny would have worn at that time. So this fundamental change in personality, how you present yourself, I became very radicalised. I was one-track minded, all about church and God and that kind of thing, which was a total change from before. Initially, I was targeted really by this lovely woman, and she seemed to decide that I was someone who was ripe for picking for the church and to become a Christian. And as I say, I was, smoking and just living a normal kind of life. And she just kept on, and she was recruiting me. She took me to this church, and there was a meeting there, and there was a lot of emotion and music, and I ended up becoming a Christian on that day. And there was something happening in me. I was very emotional, very moved by something. Now I think, some of these situations create kind of almost trance-like states, and so, you get kind of sucked in. There was a lot of love bombing, as they call it. Everyone was like, oh, it's lovely to have you here, and I'm like, ooh. And I got kind of, and that was like a big step into that world. And I didn't leave that world for 25 years. I guess because I became more and more radicalised, more and more one-track minded is what I mean by that, really like a horse with the blinkers on. I wasn't seeing other things. I was just seeing the church and God and this sort of thing. I went to be an au pair for this family. Now, I was the last person to be an au pair. I knew nothing about children or anything. They used to the kids would shut me in the pantry. Like there was 7 children. 7 children, some were older, right down to little ones. And I didn't ask for any money. So I had this mentality that God would provide for everything. It wasn't a happy place for me. I had then contact with the Community, and they told me that they would offer me counselling. So I went to the Community, it wasn't actually a community then, it was a fellowship, but they said they had training in counselling, and they had half a day's training in counselling, I discovered many years later. There was a group of women who were living in a household who were at the university, who were also part of this fellowship, and they let me stay with them for free. And there's no such thing as a free meal, by the way. And then that was it. I ended up staying. I ended up becoming a member, and very quickly after I joined, then the community was formed. This new leader came in and took over from the founder, and he was very bent on our public image and how we were perceived. And we were kind of in a marketplace at that period of time where there were lots of communities springing up all around the world. It was really a big movement in the late 60s, 70s. Gradually, he started terrorizing people. Like, if you step out of line, if you do something wrong, you'll be punished. And being punished can come in different ways. That you can be rebuked, shouted at, whatever, and that would happen. But then if you're starting to be inflicted, if they start to inflict pain on you, then that takes you to another level. I was beaten a number of times, but once really badly. I was bleeding on my back, and I should have, or I couldn't, and not should have, but I could have gone to the authorities and said, this is what's happened to me. But there was no knowledge in my mind that I was being abused. None at all. This was what I deserved because I was a sinful person, and this is what needed to happen. That was all of my rationale with it. Then the others came and they washed my back, and they said, because they decided they would forgive me for whatever sin it was. I paid the price of it. And so one of the things that happened was what they call a trauma bond. So instead of going, I'm out of here, it actually sucked me in more, because they were very kind to me and they looked after my back, and they, I think, probably put me to bed, and they made me feel loved and soothed. It was like living in Dracula's castle. It's hard to explain the feelings around how it felt to be in such a terribly coercive kind of situation. It took me, I can't even think how many years, to tell people like my friends that this had happened to me. The main leader lived in a household with some women who he abused endlessly. He thought James Bond was the ideal Christian man, which is laughable and ludicrous. And nobody would think that, whatever they thought about Christianity or anything. And they had to have martinis in the bath. The women had to share baths. They had to walk around in their underpants. He used to have these snogging sessions and belly dancing. This is this so-called Christian leader. And, so much sexual abuse going on. The women in the leader's household actually challenged him one day. I knew nothing about this happening, but they actually challenged him. They said, this is not a Christian way of being. We don't like what's happening. And apparently he jumped out of the window and ran away, being a creep and a coward. And he ran round to the other households going, trying then to get people on his side. Oh, they've turned against me. And I think probably within a month, even less, the whole thing just split. And I had no idea what was happening. I was so lost to myself. We continued going to churches, and the church we went to, which was fine, it wasn't a cult, but they told us they understood about cults, and they really didn't. And they did us a terrible disfavor, because we really needed help to get the psychological, spiritual, emotional, physical trauma a knowledge, all the things that we needed on leaving were not given to us, and they just expected us to kind of knuckle down and be part of that church. And so the cult was still a ticking time bomb in our heads. You know, and they say, you know, it's sometimes easier to physically leave the cult than get the cult out of your head, and that is true. And so it took another 14 years of going to church, still being in that cult mindset. I felt very low. I realized now I just felt really trapped, and I wanted to die. I didn't want to kill myself, but I wanted to die because I couldn't see any way out of the church, because I believed I would go to hell if I left the church. And I started to have this desire to become a counsellor because I couldn't find anybody who could help me. And so I made the decision to train as a counsellor. And I told the doctor I didn't think I shouldn't be let loose on anybody after my history, you know. And she was like, no, she said, you go and you get trained and you have therapy yourself and you do the work you need to do and you'll be great. So with her encouragement, I trained, and I couldn't train outside the church. I was still too much in that world. And so I did a diploma in pastoral counselling. And actually, it was such a helpful step for me. It was part of my exiting, because in that situation, I met Christians who were counsellors, who were ethical, who were measured, who wanted me to think for myself, who were really, they're wonderful. And I still know pretty well all of them. And, you know, they've always continued to be these balanced people, even though actually they've remained in the church and I didn't. Gradually, you know, I just thought, you know, I've just had enough of church. I've had enough of people speaking long sermons. I just can't stomach it anymore. And because the Bible became weaponized, it was very triggering for me as well to go into those settings. And so, you know, I think Tony and I seemed to go on the same path with that, thankfully. And we both thought, actually, I'm done with it. And then I did a PhD, and I was 50. Well, I completed the PhD when I was 63, so it's never too late to do anything. And my investigation all the way along was what helps former cult members recover from an abusive cult experience. Coercive control, as I understand it, and as it's embedded in the law at the moment, is in an intimate relationship, or, you know, a family intimate relationship. And so although people who are in these types of groups are experiencing all the criteria of coercive control, they cannot instigate those laws. What I and many others would like to see happen is just a shift in the law to include groups. I think it's essential. You know, there's so many people who are being controlled and broken by these groups. And they come to me all the time. I mean, it's honestly, the stream is steady. I think that there are many more cults than people realize, or cultic groups, however you're going to define it, but controlling and ultimately harmful.